Fescar Maguivule agus falche do leanan Nashantana Halaba. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Library of Scotland. My name is Ulrika Hogg, and I work in the Manuscripts Division of this library. We have the very great pleasure tonight of welcoming as a speaker Dr. Domhnall Uilleam Stiùbhart. Domhnall Uilleam has been senior lecturer at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig since 2006, and before that he was working on the Carmichael Watson project at Edinburgh University Library. Domhnall Uilleam is well known as an expert on Highland history and traditions. He's got an incredibly deep and detailed knowledge of this field, which he has always very generously shared with the world at large. And I can testify to this because nobody has ever given us a bigger handout at any talk, at any conference I've ever been to, and that's the truth. We're also very grateful. He's not giving us a handout tonight, but we're very grateful to him for the lasting information he's left with us in our current Sgeul exhibition, where he and Professor Hugh Cheap, also from Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, very kindly translated our panel texts into Gaelic and supplied us with additional text as well. Tonight he's here to talk to us about stories of a life and a life of stories, a talk to accompany our exhibition on John Francis Campbell of Islay, and I know we're in for an absolute treat. Thank you very much, Don.
Thanks very much for coming, and thanks to you as well, all of you who are watching online as well. Thanks to the National Library for inviting me, and thanks to the technical team as well for being so professional in dealing with me coming down from the Isle of Skye today. This evening I'll be discussing, as Ulrika has just told you, the life, work and times of John Francis Campbell to a certain extent, as far as the publication of the popular tales of the West Highlands, volumes 1 to 4, 1860 to 1862. I don't want to shortchange you, and I don't want to try your patience, let alone have Kenny dragging me away from the lectern after an hour. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you the first half of Campbell's life, and then later on, I hope later on this year, maybe at the beginning of next year, we'll do part 2 as well. So let's see if this works. Oh, it works. Great. Thank you. This is a brief biography of Campbell, the heading rather, I should say, to a brief biography of Campbell I wrote for the Edinburgh Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Writers. So I hope that you're going to leave this room with a better sense of the very complex contours of this man's life, especially the formative years, the defining years. You'll get to know the individuals, the relationships, and the historical forces that helped to shape his life. And also you get a notion of the young man himself, his ambitions, his hopes and fears, but also the frustrations and the challenges that he faced during his life, and perhaps why he was unable to fulfill his initial promise. So if Kenny will let me, as I said, I'll return and talk in more detail about the actual mechanics of collecting the stories for his great Popular Tales project. And we can take then a longer look at the collectors, the storytellers, the story they told, how they were recorded, how they were edited, and how they were published. But tonight it's going to be John Francis Campbell, Volume 1. And forgive me if this time round there'll be at least slightly more about the General Board of Health Warming and Ventilation Commission report of 1857, rather than talking horses, terrifying giants, flying magical flights and wicked stepmothers. But we'll deal with a bit of this. Now, one key role I didn't mention here is photographer. And the early 1860s were the era of cartomania in London society. We've got thousands of sitters having their portraits taken for usually fairly formal carte de visite. Very much a fashion. It's like an early version of social media. It's almost like a mid-Victorian Instagram, if you will. Among these portraits, many thousands of portraits, we can find John Francis Campbell's stepmother and step-siblings. That's a family that he shouldered responsibility for in the aftermath of his father's bankruptcy, his humiliating loss of the family estates of Islay and Woodhall in Lanarkshire, and his father's early death in 1855. This here's his stepmother, Catherine Isabella Campbell, née Cole. She's only 5 years older than John Francis himself. And you can see that the photographer, the society portraitist, Camille Sylvie, has mistaken her for Campbell's wife. She starts off as Mrs. J.F. Campbell, and then that's changed. She was then, I don't know if you can see this, but she was quite blind as a result, at least partly, of the trauma which she had undergone in the wake of the disaster of the family's fortunes, losing their estate. John Francis Campbell had 4 stepsisters. He had Augusta, Isla, Violet, and Castelia, and he also had a younger stepbrother, Walter. This is Violet, 19 years old. And this is Walter, who later in life became, like Campbell, a great favourite of Queen Victoria and a courtier. And this is Castelia. In a few years' time, she's going to make a rather grand and very surprising marriage to the second Earl Granville, one of the foremost liberal statesmen of his day. He was a 50-year-old widower and she was just 18 years old. It was quite a scandal at the time. The weekly salons that Castelia would hold meant that she, during her lifetime, was considerably better known than her brother John Francis Campbell, though he himself kept salons as well. Note how long-lived Castelia was. There's absolutely no doubt that our late Queen would have known Castelia Granville. She'd have known this woman in her old age who'd spent her adolescence under the care and guardianship of her stepbrother John Francis Campbell at his villa in Camden Hill in Kensington, near the mansion of his friend and his patron, George Campbell, the 8th Duke of Argyll. And finally, here's carte de visite of John Francis Campbell himself. This is probably also a Camille Sylvie portrait taken sometime in 1860. As you can see, it's quite different from your usual carte de visite. You can feel the charismatic intensity. You can feel the physicality of Campbell's presence. As he leans forward, he breaks the fourth wall, confidently meeting and challenging our gaze. There's no self-conscious awkwardness. There's no gazing off in the middle distance. There's no stiffness. There's no over-dramatization. It's somebody who knows about photography. He knows about composition. He knows about how to make an impression. He also looks very tired because he's also working as secretary of the Parliamentary Lighthouse Commission and at the same time as project overseer, editor and translator of the 4 volumes of Popular Tales of the West Highlands. Campbell notes, as secretary, I would work till I used to come home exhausted and sleep on the rug. Once upon a time then, John Francis Campbell, who was he? To his family, he was John or Johnny. To his patron, mentor and clan chief, George Douglas Campbell, Duke of Argyll, he was Ian. His relatives, friends and acquaintances knew him as young Isla or Ian Isla. And to the Gaels of Scotland, he was and remains Ian Gàidhealtachd, young John of Isla. As we've seen, he was born in Edinburgh in 1821, and he was the only son of Walter Frederick Campbell and his first wife and first cousin as well, actually, Lady Eleanor Charteris. An elder sister, Margaret Susan Campbell, died in infancy. So, on his father's side, John Francis Campbell's grandparents were John Campbell of Isla MP and this lady here, Lady Charlotte Campbell. Lady Charlotte was the remarkably beautiful daughter of John Campbell MP, 5th Duke of Argyll. And Lady Mary Wortley Montague describes her in her youth. What a beautiful woman she was. What an arm and hand. I've seen the whole opera house turn to look at it. That's the arm and the hand in front of the box. She must have been a bit awful. Here's Gilray having some fun with her. She was a notorious beau monde it girl in the mid-1790s. And as you can see here, she was the first person to introduce the empire silhouette into Britain. She did away with stays, and she had the short-waisted empire dress. Instead, the elegant person of her ladyship appears to most advantage when nature is unrestrained. There you are. On his mother's side, John Francis Campbell's grandparents are Francis Charteris, 6th Earl of Wemyss, and Margaret Campbell, who he's very, very close to in his youth, daughter of Walter Campbell of Skipness, Shawfield, Nyla, and thus a sister of his paternal grandfather, John Campbell. So his grandmother on one side, and it was his great aunt on the other. You need to be a Highlander to be interested in these things, but they are interesting. John Francis Campbell followed the Scottish custom of being named after his two grandfathers, John and Francis. Despite serious long-standing financial troubles, the Campbells of Islay cultivated elegance, swagger and panache. Although John Francis Campbell's father Walter, he had a rather undistinguished political career as Member of Parliament for Argyllshire, he was an inveterate clubman on the London scene. During his boyhood at Eton, he had been renowned as one of the smartest dressers in the college. And in Gaelic tradition, it may be that he was the subject of a St Kilda love song composed to him when he visited the island on his yacht, Gàidhealtachd, the young man of the brown hair. So he's cutting a dash in Eton and St Kilda at the same time, possibly. For 2 generations, the Islay family played the national marriage market with exceptional canniness. They converted the charisma of fashionable romantic Highlandism into valuable social capital, compensating for their lack of title and wealth. John's aunts and great-aunts made a series of remarkable alliances in high society, mainly but not exclusively among the grand Whig aristocracy. So we've got Campbell being related to the Douglases of Wemyss, the Barringtons, the Gordon Cummings of Altyre, the Uxbridge Earls of Anglesey, the Tullamores, the Russells, and the Lennoxes. The Campbells of Islay took their matchmaking very seriously indeed. Following the death of Campbell's grandfather, someone in the family, I presume it was Lady Charlotte, hired the greatest Italian sculptor of the age, Lorenzo Bartolini of Florence, to make this charming, exquisite, and dare I say it, rather sexy double portrait of the 2 youngest sisters, Julia and Emma, dancing a waltz together. And they were branded as the Maids of Argyll, a none too subtle attempt to launch them on the national marriage market. John Francis also enjoyed valuable social connections through his close cousins and family patrons, the Campbell Dukes of Argyll, and through the Duke of Argyll's first wife, Lady Elizabeth Lucen Gower, to her family, that plutocratically rich family, the Sutherlands, the Dukes of Sutherland. And also particularly important was Lady Elizabeth's mother here, the redoubtable and charismatic Duchess Harriet, Mistress of the Robes, intimate of Queen Victoria, known to Gaels as eventful, the big lady. These connections would be crucial throughout John's life, especially after the wreck of his family's fortunes during the Great Highland Famine. So very quickly, just there are at least 2 very creative women in John's family. There's his rackety grandmother, Lady Charlotte. She became a lady-in-waiting to Caroline, Princess of Wales, a strange wife of the Prince Regent. Then she made a rather scandalous second marriage. And then she wrote 13 sentimental high society novels, several religious books, a cookbook, and very profitably a best-selling, lucrative, and again somewhat scandalous memoir of her time in the courtier circle of Princess Caroline. And then we've got her daughter, John's aunt, Eliza Gordon Cumming, painter, as you can see there, horticulturalist, and in later years of her life, she was quite a well-known fossil collector. John Francis Campbell was mostly brought up here at Islay House on his family's estate in Islay. Walter had succeeded the estate when he was 18 years old in 1816, and he took care that John Francis mixed with local children, that he should be brought up as a Gaelic speaker. John Francis retained fond memories of his youth, where under the tutelage of his piper nurse, himself John Campbell, known as Ianc Ban, he was a member of a distinguished piping family. And with Ian Ban, John Francis Campbell learnt hardiness, he learnt resilience, he learnt the ability to speak to anybody he met. As he writes himself, I got to know a good deal about the ways of the Highlanders by growing up as a Highlander myself. This rough and tumble childhood upbringing would have stood John Francis in good stead during several years of semi-feral existence in what was then still a largely unreformed Eton College. And then he subsequently matriculated at Edinburgh, where he studied law, as well as fostering a lifelong fascination with natural science, particularly geology, glaciology, and optics. Now, during John Francis' childhood, the landscape of Islay was being transformed in a gradual but ultimately substantial series of improvements directed by his father. Land was reclaimed, agriculture was reorganised, local trade, crafts and industry were promoted, especially fishing and weaving and distilling. There's a network of planned villages, a network of local schools, and a greatly developed transport infrastructure. Islay is what it is today because of Walter Frederick Campbell. We've got Port Ellen and Port Weems, called after his wife, Port Charlotte, called after his mother. And it does look very much as if young John Francis is being groomed to follow in his father's footsteps as a national politician, as an MP. Through his father, his aunts, and his cousin, the Duke of Argyll, he had a wealth of political contacts among the Whigs, and in 1844 we see him being enrolled as a member of Brooks's in London, the emblematic Whig gentlemen's club. It's also worth noting that he was taught Lorne Gaelic. He wasn't taught Islay Gaelic, and I wonder if that's because he was sort of being brought up as an Argyllshire representative as well as just an Eloch. But anyway, Walter Campbell's ambitious work in his estate, it didn't succeed. Overburdened by long-standing debts, accumulated rent arrears, battered by economic depression and harvest failure, hobbled by incompetent administration, the estate eventually foundered as a result of the major potato famine in the late 1840s. Annual interest payments and debts and obligations under family annuities were outstripping estate income. Now, in August 1847, Walter and his sons and a guard of honour from Islay were presented to Queen Victoria at Inverera. But barely 4 months later, the family estates of Islay and Wootall were taken out of his hands. He was encumbered with £815,000 worth of debt, which is about £68 million today, and in poor health, he fled to Naples and then eventually settled in Avranches in Normandy, bankrupt, living in genteel poverty with his second wife, Catherine, who we've seen already, who was going blind as a result of the trauma. As heir, John was left to salvage what he could from the humiliating wreck of his family finances. This is a particularly brutal time for John Francis Campbell. It was an ordeal marked by profound shame and humiliation. He spent his last night in Islay at Bowmore keeping watch over the tomb of his mother. And the next morning there was an awful walk with his siblings through watching crowds at Port Ellen. Many of them would doubtless have been fearing imminent starvation, to board the ship that would take him away from Islay, and he wouldn't properly return for over 30 years. He was deprived of his estate, his standing, and any hope of the political influence and the accompanying social prestige for which he had been brought up. To make matters even worse, to salvage something from his father's his family's collapse, he had to register himself as principal creditor for his own father. For some time afterwards, John Francis entertained secret, outlandish fantasies of rescuing the family estate. Maybe the Queen, she'd buy Islay, and John Francis would be appointed estate factor. Maybe he'd emigrate to California and he'd make his fortune in the gold rush. Campbell's ordeal was exacerbated by a trip to revolution-torn France in 1848 to visit his family in Normandy. Already Islay was lost, and it looked as if the society and the economy of the Highlands were going down, but it also looked maybe as if his entire social class across Europe was also facing imminent ruin. And I'd suggest that this trauma remained with Campbell all of his life. But on the surface, at least, Campbell appeared to face up to and cope with his family's fall and humiliation. His friends and relations responded to this, and they showed him sympathy and respect. They knew what he had gone through with his family, but for the rest of his life, John Francis Campbell would be poor John, He'd be called Poor Islay. He was a living reminder to his aristocratic contemporaries of the potential financial and social catastrophe that they all faced, heavily indebted as many were, faced with an increasingly hostile populace and an unpredictable world. John Francis Campbell would make his way through that world, relying on his own talents and wits. There he is with the family. But he could also call upon networks of powerful relations and family friends. And they recognized his abilities, they enjoyed his company, and they were impressed by his dignity and insouciance in the face of adversity. They would continue to support him. Although now bereft of land and hereditary title, John Francis Campbell was nevertheless known as John Francis Campbell of Islay throughout his life. Well, he continued his legal studies in London, called to the bar in 1851, but he never really became a barrister, though he would describe himself as a barrister in censuses and correspondence. He became he was appointed assistant private secretary to his cousin, the Duke of Argyll, who served as Lord Privy Seal in the Aberdeen ministry between 1852 and 55. In 1853, the Duke and his family bought a London home in Kensington, which they called Argyll Lodge. Shortly afterwards, John would move into a villa nearby called Niddry Lodge. And there, following the death of his father in exile in Normandy in February 1855, he would find himself responsible for his stepmother, her mother, and 5 step-siblings, ranging in age from 8 to 17. So it may be that change of circumstances that led him, probably with Argyll's patronage, to be appointed Assistant Secretary to the newly constituted General Board of Health. Let's see, there's his house there, which is unfortunately demolished. That's his villa, Niddry Lodge. And this is his boss at the General Board of Health, Tom Taylor, who was a prolific dramatist and a contributor to Punch, full of energy and all-round polymath, just like John Francis Campbell himself. And we can imagine both of them flanning around London, up and down Regent Street together. Between 1856 and 58, Campbell served as secretary, that is, compiler, of the board's report on the warming and ventilation of dwellings. Recurrent epidemics of cholera and other diseases, and the pervasive smokes and smells of the industrial metropolis, culminating in the Great Stink of 1858, meant that indoor ventilation and circulation of air were extremely important. The more so given the prevalence of miasmic theory, the idea that infections were spread through putrefaction in the air. So in his work for the report, Campbell was not only recording what other people said, but he also undertook a series of very ingenious experiments at home. He tested ventilation bricks and pipes. He traced the circulation of air in rooms by using a rubber balloon. And he used his newly devised sunlight recorder for observation as well. But he was very frustrated with the slow progress of this report. And so he took it upon himself as secretary to write up a draft report on his own, only to see the commissioners ignore his recommendations in their official version. Campbell was deeply disappointed. He believed that his own opinions had either been sidelined or even worse, they'd been plagiarized by the commissioners. And in the printed copy, which we have upstairs among Campbell's papers of the report, he records his dissatisfaction and his exasperation in the margins. Campbell, he wasn't only just, here's his, talking about the experiments he was doing with the balloon. And there's his sunlight recorder recordings there. We'll see his sunlight recorder soon as well. Campbell also spent the decade travelling. He wasn't just researching and collating official reports in London. As a young man, he had made a grand tour to the Mediterranean with this man here, Dr. William Fullerton Cumming, who's a close friend of the family, and he later became a sort of mentor and confidant to Campbell himself. He made a journey to Austria in 1846 and a trip to France in 1848 and then he began making series of summer expeditions and autumn expeditions to Scandinavia. For Campbell, Scandinavia served as a substitute Highlands, as a time when it was very painful for him maybe to return there. It was a means of getting away from the dirt and smoke of the metropolis. Also, it was a place to think, to absorb new cultures, and also, I'm sure, it was a place for sport. We should remember that Campbell was a great aficionado of hunting, shooting, and fishing. Campbell would spend his time while he was travelling composing travel diaries or scrapbooks for his extended family, illustrated with increasingly proficient watercolour sketches. And you can see they're not just picture postcards. They're sketches illustrating the geology of the landscape. They illustrate atmospheric effects. They illustrate the play of sunlight on land and on sea. Cool. Campbell's diaries weren't just private meditations for himself either, but they were rather public productions. They were travel scrapbooks intended to be shared, to be read aloud, sent to his family, friends, and acquaintances. And we can see here Lord Lorne, his cousin, thinking you won't mind. He's married to Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter. I want to take your log to Windsor today. It is delightful, we think. So it was being passed around his friends and acquaintances. And in these diaries, Campbell would hone this loquacious style, his eye for detail, and his interest in character, which would be typical of his later published works. Now, I've mentioned that Campbell's time working with the General Board of Health didn't end well. In 1859, he embarked on his most demanding work to date, the Secretary of the Commission on Lights, Buoys and Beacons, in other words, the Lighthouse Commission, 1859-61. Now, Campbell was given that job because he was interested in optics, he was interested in lenses. The commission was really examining the quality of light and the quality of glass to see how best to divert light rays efficiently so they'd be useful for shipping at sea during the night. And it's very challenging work compiling this report. He made 2 trips, one around the British Isles and the other one to Spain and France. He also had to collate, edit and index all the information gathered. There were 33 volumes in total which Campbell had to index. And he also carried out a series of experiments involving light and lenses. And note also that most of this work would have to be done at night time. So it's a very demanding, very exhausting work. As with the previous report, Campbell felt that his own, that's his father, the lighthouse his father built in honour of, as a memorial for his mother. I should have mentioned that earlier on. He was interested in lighthouses before then. But as with the previous report, Campbell felt that his own opinions were dismissed. And to make matters worse, he fell out with the Astronomer Royal, who was a major figure in this commission, Professor George Airy. Campbell accused Airy not only of belittling him and his experiments, but also actually stealing Campbell's experiments and attributing them to his own son. He prepared a formal remonstrance against the Astronomer Royal, and the Astronomer Royal fell out with Campbell big time, and this animus endured for the next 2 decades. So it was a very difficult few years, but nevertheless, during this time, Campbell began and brought to fruition the project for which he's best known today. That is the 4 volumes of popular tales of the West Highlands. Now, this evening, as I've said, I can only give you the bare essentials of this crucial episode in his life, but if the NLS will let me back, I'll talk about it in much greater detail later on, and we can look at the collectors, the storytellers, and the stories. So anyway, Campbell was at something of a loose end in the 1858. He's writing letters to the papers full of good ideas, you know, how to build a dry dock so the Great Eastern doesn't get stuck when it's launched the next time. There are problems with laying transatlantic cables, so Campbell writes a letter saying, you know, as a fisherman, I know all about how to, experiences with fishing lines, and I can offer my advice. So he needs something to do, and it comes from a very unexpected source, what he got. So at the very end of 1858, the newly established Edinburgh firm of Edmondson and Douglas, they had published popular tales from the Norse, a translation of Peter Christian Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moos, Norske Folkeeventyr, the translator of the volume and the compiler of its extensive introduction was George Webb Dasent on the left there, Scandinavian scholar, professor of English literature and modern history at King's College in London, and assistant editor of the Times. Now, Dasent had worked in these popular tales for a long time. He had also prepared an authoritative scholarly introduction, and this opened up intriguing, albeit rather misty perspectives across time and space. And he was showing the many various parallels between myths, tales, fables and legends composed and recorded in many cultures from India to Europe during a period of 3,000 years. And Dasent was saying, oh, there's family resemblances here, and there must have been a common Indo-European cultural inheritance which is rooted in India. So this is a book for the study as well as the nursery. And Popular Tales from the North was a sensation. It sold 1,000 copies in 3 months. It was a real bestseller. Now, reading through the collection, we can see John Francis Campbell taking off stories which he knew. He recognised the outlines of tales that he himself had heard as a boy in Islay, told in Gaelic by his piper nurse and others. And there's a challenge for him in the introduction, because Dasent is saying, you know, maybe these stories might exist in England, but if they do, it's only among the very poorest people and the most inaccessible people, and only the most skillful and sensitive collector could gather them. And Campbell saw this as a challenge, and he also saw, well, if you can collect these stories in Norway, on the remote westernmost edge of European civilization, then maybe we can do the same in the Scottish Highlands as well. So Dasent's Popular Tales from the North is a sort of a template for a project which Campbell was planning on his own, a scholarly work and a popular collection which might make a name for Campbell and might also earn him a modicum of financial independence. But Campbell couldn't record stories himself. He had family responsibilities, he had his official work, and he couldn't write Gaelic himself. Illiteracy in the native tongue remained the norm among Gaelic speakers. And it's a severe stumbling block in compiling popular tales. What Campbell did have were personal attributes. He was young, he had charisma, he was bold, Victorian mixture of ingenuity, focus and energy. He had no-nonsense confidence, sophistication, perhaps unusual among folklorists, and a set determination to see his undertaking through to its conclusion. He was a congenial companion, a superb conversationalist, whether it was in a thatched island ceilidh house or a West End salon. He could draw upon aristocratic connections. He could draw upon his family name. But there's also an urgency about Campbell's work. He needed money. He needed to make a name for himself. And he's also scared that somebody else would beat him to it. He also had these other skills, which I think are very important. They're skills with paper, with bureaucracy, which he had learned during the years he had spent working on official commissions of inquiry. He knew how to record oral testimony. He knew how to manage and process it. But also, very important here, he knew how to supervise and complete one-off temporary projects, which is what these commissions of inquiry were. So you've got this routine paperwork in one hand, but you've also got projects, and Campbell was very much a projects person. And that is why he was able to bring Popular Tales to this successful conclusion in such a short period of time, just 3 years as a projects man. Now, the Popular Tales can look a bit like a parliamentary commission. They've got font sizes, tables, narrators. Even in the transcriptions of its tellings, you know, it's like an official commission. But they don't only bear the mark of their editor alone. They also, their structure, their style, and their message owes much to the editor of Popular Tales of the North, George Webb Dasent, and his particular concerns in the wake of his book's publication. Now, Dasent saw in Campbell's project, he saw a chance, an opportunity to corroborate his own hypothesis that folktales had been passed down orally through the generations, through word of mouth, from the East to Europe for many, many generations, that they weren't just adapted from printed books and from manuscripts. So they were thus precious testimony of the customs, belief and mythology of our prehistoric ancestors. So Campbell's collection had to be recorded verbatim. It had to have crucial contextual details in order to be credible. So here we have it. Well, you have to tell this, note the sex, old woman, to tell her story in her own way and in her own words. And also, very, very importantly, Campbell had to record and transcribe accurately to avoid the imputation of literary fraud. He had to avoid the imputation, the accusation of being a second Ossian Macpherson, concocting Gaelic epics out of his own imagination. So Campbell's enterprise had to be above suspicion, it had to be authentic, it had to be substantiated. So this might have been quite different from Campbell's original idea. Maybe Campbell originally wanted to do something literary, like Popular Tales from the Norse, but Dasent pushed him into something which is quite different. He led Campbell away from the public square into the study, we could say. So at first Campbell thought, right, I'm going to be running this like a parliamentary commission with people all over the Highlands feeding me stories. But this is impractical for various reasons, not least because most people couldn't write Gaelic at the time. There's also animosity against landlords, animosity by ministers against worthless lying tales, and perhaps above all a belief that these stories were no longer told by people too. So in the end, Campbell relied on just a handful of individuals, usually literate in Gaelic, mostly men, whom I hope I'll take a closer look at in my next talk. Here are two examples. We've got Hector Urquhart, gamekeeper, and more importantly here we've got Hector MacLean, one of Campbell's closest friends from his boyhood and companion during the university years as well. A successful trip by Hector MacLean to Euston Barra was the crucial part of the popular tales. MacLean was able to record hundreds of pages of stories, particularly from Catholic communities, where the tradition of telling wonder tales in the Cayley House remained vigorous. Later on in the project, Campbell would recruit two very different characters. Just to mention them briefly, we've got the young exciseman Alexander Carmichael, who is very romantic, and his willingness to, it seems, fill in gaps in Gaelic lore by himself. It made his collections rather suspect to Campbell. And then we have John Dewars, very interesting character. He had taught himself Gaelic, he had taught himself to write in Gaelic, but he's a storyteller himself. And it looked that what Dewar would do would be he'd listen to stories, and then he'd go away back home and he'd write down the stories as he would tell them himself. So a very, very interesting character. And also we shouldn't forget that there are women as well giving Campbell help. Margaret Torrey, though her brother gets responsibility, he gets the praises for recording these stories. Margaret Torrey recorded a lot of stories in Benbecula in 1859. And then Mary McTavish, childhood friend of Campbell, and Charlotte Dempster, who made a wonderful collection of Sutherlandshire lore as well in English. She couldn't speak Gaelic. She's a proper folklorist herself. Campbell wasn't sure what he wanted to collect at first either. He didn't have the idea of collecting wonder tales, that is, princes and princesses and talking horses and dragons and ogres and stuff. He didn't really have that in mind at first. He just wanted to collect lore. But eventually he was able to explain to his collectors what they want. So they want the stories known as Sgeul, and he's got the beginning, Vadí aun Rayisho. Once upon a time there was a king. And it finishes with Mandihul Latushin Hath Biohast, unless they have died since they are still alive. And then again, he's telling somebody else here. He's saying, I don't want true stories. I want the biggest lies that were ever told about giants and heroes and serpents and men flying and birds and so on. He also had problems trusting the collectors, and we can talk about that in another time as well. Collecting had to be above board. We've seen that it has to be authentic, it has to be genuine, it has to be verbatim. No rewriting and no stories purloined from Arabian Nights or Heaven Help Me from popular tales from the Norse. So the collectors had to be kept under a tight string as well. And the collectors found it difficult to record storytellers because storytellers weren't used to reciting at dictation speed while somebody wrote their stories out with a pencil or a pen in front of them. So we've got poor old Donald McPhee here from Carnan in the north end of South Uist. He loses his way. He wants to tell his best story to Hector MacLean, and he messes it up not once but twice because he's not used to speaking slowly to the reciter. It's especially a problem for old men, and we've seen how Dewar short-circuited that problem by just telling his own stories. We've lost it. Maybe it's me there. Maybe it's run out of battery. That's great. Thank you. The collector John Dewar, we've seen how he short-circuited this problem by memorizing the stories and telling them again in his own words. When other collectors said, Dewar, you shouldn't be doing this, apparently he learnt shorthand and took down the stories that way. Very ingenious man. And then there were Campbell's own problems, which I can go on for hours, but I won't, about the editing and the collating and the translating and the researching the notes and writing the introduction, which got bigger and bigger and bigger. They couldn't find a Gaelic-speaking typesetter. So the proofs returned and they were chock full of errors. David Douglas, the publisher, suggested that the greatest Gaelic scholar of the day, Reverend Thomas McLaughlin, should edit the stories. McLaughlin disapproved of the vernacular Gaelic that the stories were told. So he began to rewrite all of Campbell's stories into literary Gaelic, fit for the printer, and Campbell blew a gasket when he saw that. And David Douglas, the publisher, would be very, very emollient. He had to promise nothing at all would be changed in order to win Campbell back. So Dasent's support in all this was absolutely crucial. Dasent was saying, look, it has to be left as it is. It has to be printed verbatim. Problems with Campbell's bizarre English style, convoluted. He wanted to be reminiscent of Gaelic idioms, but nobody liked it. It was unreadable. Campbell was even criticised for this by the barely educated John Dewar, but again, Dasent approved of this style. Dasent, his own English style in Popular Tales of the Norse is very deliberately Anglo-Saxon. It avoids Latinic constructions, and he saw Campbell as following in his footsteps. But eventually this operational routine is established. Proofs were sent to Hector MacLean. He edited them. He returned them. Campbell would translate, and the introduction be compiled, and everything went on. But these books, especially volumes 1 and 2, they're a process as much as a finished article, because new stories would come in while the books were being sort of half done. And some of these stories were better than the stories that were already typeset and printed. So we have to only read books 1, when we read book 2 especially, we have to remember this is the record of a process rather than a finished article. So I'll talk about this in greater detail later, and I'll talk about volumes 3 and 4, where he takes this sort of bizarre veering turn into Ossianic lays and Celtic art and dress, and there's lots of illustrations and engravings. And then I'll talk about Campbell's later years as a vagabond travel writer and a popular science writer in geology and an Ossianic lay collector. I'll talk about him as a courtier in Queen Victoria's dowdy and resolutely unglamorous circle. And then I'll talk about how his personality sort of curdled and soured somewhat as middle age caught up with poor John Francis Campbell. And his health started to fail, and he began to fear for the future of his own class, with the rise of radicalism, of republicanism, of Fenianism, even of Crofter radicalism in the Highlands. And a trip to Paris during the Commune didn't help. His lungs gave way, and Campbell moved to the south. He moved to the sun. He moved to Egypt, and then he moved to Cannes. And there he did his last major work on the nature of sunlight and how to record it. And maybe, if Kenny will let me, I'll talk about Campbell's domestic life, his sexuality, and his fraught relationship to 19th century imperialism. As a popular travel writer dealing in cliché on the one hand, and on the other a scholar of culture, genuinely attempting to engage with the customs, beliefs, and mythologies of non-European peoples. So very briefly, I'll finish by taking stock of Campbell's reputation as a folklore collector today. First of all, he's celebrated an international folklore collector because he was committed to recording word for word, or ensuring that his collectors did so. Now, he wasn't the only person in Europe doing this at the time. There's at least 4 others that I've come across who were doing the same as Campbell was. But Campbell's primary instruction to his collectors was record word for word. Now, everybody, all the storyteller collectors in the early 19th century, they said, we are making verbatim transcriptions of the stories as have been recorded. But almost all of them were rewriting, they're recreating, they're reinventing. The Grimms totally rewrote their stories as literate fairy tales, liberally salted with hefty doses of piety, sentimentality, literary art, and moralism. And the same goes for the Norwegian tales. They were rewritten, they were polished, they became a literary standard for Norwegian prose. But Campbell didn't do this. He'd been told by Dasent, no, you record things word for word. You can't be suspected of being another James McPherson, another Highland forger playing in gullible outsiders. And after all, this is what he'd been doing as well for several years while compiling official surveys, recording people's conversations. Now, he's also renowned among folklore scholars for the precious contextual information that he gives. His stories are not just gathered from the folk, das Volk. He's recording from named individuals. And again, this is Dasent partly to blame. Dasent says we need to know the context. We need to know that it's authentic. So we know who told the stories. We know where they lived. We know how old they were. We know, even from whom they learnt the stories themselves. And Campbell goes beyond even this. For nearly 20 years, he's been writing travel diaries. He's been gossiping entertainingly about the people he met and the situations he found himself in. He's a great conversationalist. He's a great storyteller himself. He's interested in the tellers as people, not just in the stories they tell. He understands their art. He appreciates their art. And this comes through in the descriptions he gives of what it's like to listen to these tellers, to be sitting with the audience in the Ceilidh House. And it's not just Campbell, but he also makes his collectors do this as well. We get a clear view of how stories actually circulated within communities. It's unbelievably precious for people who are interested in folklore today. But finish off with the awful question. Was it all a huge mistake? All this word-for-word accuracy and detailed contextual information is wonderful for us folklore scholars, but the books are barely readable as stories. Popular Tales of the West Highlands was not popular. It was a publishing disaster. It's more like one of Campbell's official stories than a nursery storybook. It wasn't a publishing success like Popular Tales of the North. Lots of unreadable Gaelic, tick. Bizarre English translation, tick. Overwordy introduction, tick. David Douglas, the publisher, was very proud of his work, but nevertheless he lost a substantial amount of money from the project. He would never publish a book of folklore again. As you can see here, Campbell ended his project wanting to bring out a second edition of the Popular Tales with the tales told in his own words for the general reader. Would it have been better for sales if the Popular Tales had been reinvented and polished up like every other folklore collection almost at this time? Would it have even been better for Gaelic if MacLachlan had had his way and recreated the original vernacular folktales as literate Gaelic fairy tales? Pious and moralistic maybe, but nevertheless winning an appreciative audience, being taught in schools, maybe even showing Gaels they had something just as sophisticated and popular in their own culture as the Grimm's children and household tales. These sort of questions aren't easy to answer, but they should be asked. The good news is that my friend Alan MacDonald is at present preparing a new English translation of the Popular Tales, and another friend, Michael Clavenhouse in Bonn, is preparing a new German translation of the Popular Tales, so we'll have the answer to this very quickly. Finally, why was Campbell so taken with these tales? In the Norse tales, a central stock figure is an underdog character whom Asbjörnson and Moe referred to as Asguladen, the ash lad, sort of male Cinderella figure. Of course, the same type of character appears in Gaelic stories, but without a name. The lad may be born rich or poor, a king's son or a widow's son, but there is a misstep in his life, a misfortune, maybe an evil enchantment. He loses everything he had. She diarmat here. Chayagachi vakan venna lepilush marvadiav. Is gemaun on a pulmonig, a gush gamadoch. How Castellan, no clachalaharia erichele. Hoshichat König, so that he shenak Gianna stat keine Kosche. Gusach faigai. He wouldn't stop until he found his lost love. The lad doesn't lose heart. He's clever, resourceful, and patient. And with the help of a practical, quick-witted sweetheart with magical powers, or perhaps a supernatural talking horse, the lad wins out in the end. Of course, it's impossible not to think of John Francis Campbell and what he had undergone: disaster, trauma, humiliation. The story's message was that with intelligence, ingenuity, and patience, the hero could gain half the kingdom, win the hand of a princess in marriage, and eventually live happily ever after. And by way of a coda, two of Campbell's houses, the first one, Niddry Lodge, became the Linguist Club, and Campbell would have approved of that in 1965 until its demolition in 1972. And his cottage in the Isle of Wight has become, can anybody guess? It's part of the Blackgang China Amusement Park, and it's renamed Rumpus Mansion. And you can go to Campbell's old cottage, and it's now overrun with boggarts, gremlins, pixies, and mythical creatures. So again, Campbell would have approved of this. So thank you very, very much for being so patient. And come back to part 2 when it happens. Thank you.
I feel like the real big-bagged gremlin that's coming across to pull you off stage, but thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Kenny, and thanks for your patience as well.
Not at all, it's lovely. It's time just now. Does anybody have any questions? This is the moment where you all look at me and I feel really embarrassed because no one's putting their hand up. I'm intrigued by his artwork.
Yes.
I've fallen in love with it. I think it's absolutely stunning. Some of the images there that you were showing. Was he self-taught? Where did that come from? Because it's very prolific. It's beautiful to look at.
It is. It's absolutely beautiful. What I love about it, Kenny, is that it's done by somebody who, first of all, he knows the difference between a photograph and a drawing. And in later volumes, he actually talks about this difference between a scene in a photograph and a scene in a drawing. So he's drawing out stuff in a drawing which is invisible in a photograph. But for me as well, you can see that he is somebody who knows about geology. And he is also somebody that knows about the effects of light and the place of light in the atmosphere. And there's a certain sort of, at its best, his artwork, there's a dynamism about it, which reflects his own way of looking at the world. He sees the world as being this sort of great machine, powered by the sun and powered by the energies of the Earth's core. And that comes through in this. You can see, he's making these, you see, it's not just a drawing, it's the marginalia around the drawing as well, and it all goes together. And I think that we can respond to this. And, I feel the same way about his watercolours. I think they're incredibly beautiful. And, as Ulrika was saying, if these are going to be put online by the National Library, well, fair play to you, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Fingers crossed for that.
Yeah.
But also what I'd like to know is, a lot of people, when the exhibition that is open now across the road, just opposite us here, I spoke to a lot of people, John Francis Campbell, a lot of people asked the question, who? Why is it when you've got so much folktale, wonderful tales, wonderful imagery, why is he not too well known in bigger circles?
He's known among folklorists.
Yeah.
He's a hero among folklorists. But the problem is, I think, as I've said, he's one of these people, to be honest, that everybody might have copies of his works on the shelf, but nobody will ever take it down and read it because the English is so difficult to read. He had this rather bizarre style. It's a rebarbative book. It's not easy to read, and that's why I was just throwing in this little grenade at the end of the speech saying, you know, maybe he should have been like the Grimms, maybe he should have been like Asbjørnsen and Moe and rewritten the stories so they'd be more appealing to a wider audience. So I think that's part of the problem. To us scholars, he's an extraordinary scholar. He's in advance of his time, but maybe 2 generations in advance of his time. But in fact, I think he's never been presented in such a way that we can appreciate just what an amazing man he was. Now, if we have an illustrated edition with, with his own information about the storytellers and his collectors, what they said about that, it would suddenly come alive. It'd be wonderful. So I think he's a sleeping giant, and he's waiting to come once more onto the stage.
Yep, bear with me 2 seconds until I'm not as quick as I used to be.
So, if just following on what you were saying, if he was so unpopular and so unreadable, and he was the first person to really collect all these things, how did your ordinary reading public or get to know about these stories, apart from the people who heard them firsthand? How, if he was such a failure, how did these stories become so well known to a broader public?
People knew about Campbell, and they did. I mean, I'm being a bit unfair. People did buy the book, but it's sort of tailing off, from volume 1 right the way through to volume 4. There's sort of tailing off in the buyers. But how did he become well known? How the stories become? Oh, the stories were told. The stories were told orally,
Yeah, I get that. And in the particular Isla or wherever.
Yes.
But how did these stories become more sort of known throughout Scotland? Like, how did the Isla stories become known?
Oh, right. I'm going to lob in another hand grenade here and say that, these stories are spread across the Highlands. They're also being told in the lowlands. There's a lot of coming and going. People from the Highlands would come down every autumn, and they'd be working in the harvest, or they'd be working on the Industrial Revolution, digging canals and stuff. And during the night, they'd tell stories to each other. And these stories would be learnt, they'd be translated, and when people went home, they'd tell the stories back in their own ceilidh houses or whatever. I think part of the problem is, in terms of lowland stories, is that we didn't have the collectors because people didn't think that they were being recorded. There's nothing there to be recorded. But I think there was. I mean, be careful about something like, an Isla story or something like that. It was recorded in Isla, but that wasn't to say that there were versions being, told in Gaelic everywhere from Sutherlandshire right the way down to Kintyre, and in Ireland, and in Lowlands, and all across England as well. These are tale types. There are different nuances, different versions in different parts of the British Isles and different parts of Europe, but it's effectively the same story, or the same basic structure of the story.
Just if we're doing a conversation, we've got people at home tuning in, so I just need you to...
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
No, go ahead. It's interesting. I can talk about this till midnight. So.
So yeah, I get all that, thank you. But what happens when you get a literate Scottish public? They don't go back immediately to the Campbell then because he's so unreadable.
Yeah,
so
they
how
don't.
does that? Or they would?
No, not really.
No, sorry, no. So how do these tales come into books that I remember my granny might have had
sure.
in the 1900s or 20s?
Yeah. Well, folklorists would still tell them. Would still read John Francis Campbell, and they'd sort of take them in there and they'd put them into popular. But we miss. In Ireland they took a lot of these folk tales, I should say, and made them, sort of popularised them, rewrote them, and had them being taught in schools. And we didn't really have that in Scotland because you didn't have Gaelic being taught in schools, for instance. So these stories were basically, they were still told orally, but they didn't have the same effect on literate and Gaelic literature as happened in Ireland, which is a huge mistake because they're lovely stories. They're great to read and they're really, really interesting. But they just didn't make that, because of various, political, cultural reasons, they just didn't make that jump, the leap to the same extent. So we're still waiting for that just now.
Thanks very much for our fantastic talk, Sabhal Mòr, giving the kind of prevailing sort of social attitudes towards Gaelic at the time, and the collecting of Gaelic folklore. Were there any key individuals from his own social order that kind of supported his collecting or indeed tried to undermine it?
That's a very, very good question.
Or was he just a very single-minded individual?
He was single-minded and he had a good idea. I think people were interested in stories no matter what your class was. I mean, the Duke of Argyll was interested in these stories, but he was more especially interested in historical tales about the Campbells. So they were interested in lore, but they were interested in different sorts of lore. Lady Charlotte Dempster of Sgeul, who I mentioned there, was a proper folklorist, and she did recording. When we look at Campbell, we have to remember that one of the reasons why Campbell was able to make his way in society was, like his father, like his aunts, they had this sort of romantic Highlandism about them, and that was part of it. Campbell was a great raconteur, he was a great storyteller. So he'd go down to London, he'd go to the country houses, and he had these wonderful stories about what it was like going to the Hebrides and writing down, hearing these tales. And he also had a great repertoire of songs which he would sing. He wasn't just a storyteller, he was a singer, and he knew the importance of a good song at certain times. So that's one of the reasons I think why he became a courtier of Queen Victoria in the end. He was just full of stories, and these stories were attractive, especially to the Queen, who loved Highlanders. It's interesting, but yeah, it's a very good question in a general sense about the role of Gaelic lore. Thank you.
I was just going to ask, because it was happening at the time, what was his attitude, or was he aware, or his people were aware of the clearances? I mean, they got the stories from the poor people. Did they realise what was being done to them?
Well, volume 2 of this talk, I do want to mention that because he returns to Ireland in 1878 as part of the election campaign of Lord Colin, isn't it? The fourth son of the Duke of Argyll. He's a trash. He's just a useless figure. But Campbell was brought in to get the votes because Campbell had respect that the Duke's son didn't have. And they all came out cheering for Campbell. So Campbell went back to Islay and he saw and heard what was going on in Islay. Now, there had been major clearances in Islay during this period in the Oa in the 1860s. Not just that, but the people of, the Morrisons who were running Islay at the time, they treated the Gaelic, the islanders as, troch, they were just rubbish. And they brought in people from the lowlands to run the island. There's a quote from an Islandman writing to John Francis Campbell, and he says, look, the way the estate is being run nowadays, even if I were Sir Isaac Newton, I wouldn't get a job with the estate management because they just take in people from the outside. So he knew what was going on. And he was offended and worried about it. But just like Alexander Carmichael, he felt he couldn't raise his voice against this because he'd lose all his mates. And also at the time, you can see this during the 1870s, as I was saying, his view on the world sours during this time, like a lot of people his age. They think there's a new radicalism in the air. They think that the world is, the foundations of their world is being eaten away by radicalism. So he turns against John Murdoch, for instance, a great Islay journalist who was a great crusading supporter of the Crofters' cause and somebody who they knew well from Islay. But you can see there's a split between the two during the 1870s. As I've said, a rather ill-advised visit to Paris in 1871 during the time the Commune sort of turned John Francis Campbell rather badly against radicalism, and he remained so for the rest of his life, I think. So, you know, we have to be careful about these people. Don't make them plaster saints. Don't be romantic about them. There's good sides and bad sides about them.
Time for one more question. Just put it with me.
Yeah, I must admit, I only knew of him as a folklorist, and I was fascinated about all this stuff he'd done before that and afterwards.
Exactly, yes.
And the collection of these books was only 2 years. Mm-hmm. So did he regard this just as a sort of a hobby, something to do between other things, or was it a life's work, to consecrate his life to it? First of all, I think what I'm trying to show is that, you know, the more you know about his life outside stories, the more you understand why he was able to collect stories, why he was interested in it, and also why he was so good at it and able to run that project and get it finished in 3 years. I mean, you know, imagine that in academia nowadays, running a project for 3 years and 4 volumes at the end and all that. It's just unthinkable. He was great at that. The other thing which I say is he was a man of many enthusiasms, and he'd jump from subject to subject. So he was interested in tales, but he felt that he had recorded the best of the crop, you know, by 1861 or so. And there was, you know, he might have been right, I don't know, but he felt there was nothing more to do about that. He then moved on to the Ossianic tales, and the idea was he was going to show the truth about James Macpherson's Ossianic epics and the originals, and he was going to publish all of that. So he's interested in that. He was also helping the Duke of Argyll, who hired John Dewar, who we've met earlier on, as a collector of historical tales in the late 1860s until his death in 1872, and John Francis Campbell was very much involved in that too. So he kept an interest in Highland lore and literature for many years afterwards. But he was also interested, as I said, he was interested in light, he was interested in coal, he was interested in thermography. You know, it all comes together. He's a man of many, many, many interests, and the internet is a great help. He couldn't do it without the internet. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I need to bring this evening's event to close. We're left with the John Francis Campbell's night on canvas, as you can see, so forgive us for that little technical hiccup at the very end. I hope you've all enjoyed this evening as much as I have. Please, we've still got time, the exhibition's open. If you want to go and have a little visit to it just now, if not, please come back. And it's open till 20th of April next year, if I remember correctly. Everybody that's viewed in from home, thank you so much. Thank you, Ulrika. Those at home, please come and join us in the summer. If you're in town, please do come and visit the exhibition and visit us here at the library. Thank you from Edinburgh College, who have done a brilliant job, to YouTube the event tonight. Thank you again, all of you, for coming along and supporting us here at the library. Please join me in thanking Domhnall.